This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Hold on a minute. I need to do something real quick. That one's for you, Tony Khan. Thank you. Thank you for making the right decision and being able to negotiate getting Mark Briscoe on television. I imagine it wasn't an easy conversation, but the fact they were able to work that out and get the TBS execs to sign off on allowing Mark Briscoe to be on Dynamite this week, hats off to you. I say a lot of things about AEW, and I mean a lot of what I say. They make a lot of bonehead decisions on a weekly basis, especially when it comes to the booking. And you watch the podcast, you hear me talk about that a million times in like every Dynamite review we've ever done. But when they make the right call, I'll give them credit where it's earned. This needed to happen. And to be honest with you, I don't really think it's even up for debate. This is probably the one common trait that I share amongst pretty much every wrestling fan out there. Jay Briscoe needed a tribute package devoted to him on Dynamite. And Mark needed to be on the show to dedicate at least one match to him. And we got both of them. And again, that took a lot of courage from Tony to step up to the plate and get the network to approve it. I'm sure he fought hard. Now, does that mean we can expect Mark Briscoe as a regular on Dynamite programming in the future? My guess would be probably not. Not saying it's totally out of the realm of possibilities. And they let Nick Gage work a match with Jericho on TV at one point, so anything's possible. But I have to tip my hat to Tony for getting that sanctioned by the network. That was exactly what they needed to do. Now, arguably, I could sit here and talk about how it needed to happen a week ago, but who knows? For all we know, there may have been some more fan backlash that helped to sway the decision. I mean, we really don't know what happened behind the scenes in the last week, but I think you're crazy if you try and convince me that the executives were ignoring the fan outrage over them not originally being permitted to air Jay or Mark on Dynamite. News travels fast, people. And when you got the owner of a wrestling company on top of close to 1 million viewers, all unanimously behind the decision that Mark and Jay needed to have a featured spot on Dynamite, I mean, really, at that point, the only body that was getting in the way was whoever was calling the shots at Warner Brothers. And while I know it's sort of a cold open to begin the podcast this week, it does tie hand in hand with the actual main event of Dynamite. So let's go ahead and just recap the Mark Briscoe match. It was Mark versus Jay Lethal. And this was no strings attached Jay Lethal for a change. No Sanjay, no Jeff Jarrett, no Great Khali bootleg to muddy up the waters in any way. It was the old, serious, button-down pro wrestler version of Jay Lethal. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here wondering to myself, boy, wouldn't it have been nice to get that version of Lethal more than like 10% of the time we see him work on TV? It was babyface versus babyface, and You heard me here on last week's Dynamite Report, spending more than half the review complaining and griping about the fact that virtually every TV match on the show is a babyface match, more or less. There were like one or two exceptions in that role, but out of like the 5 or 6 matches I reported on last week, how many of them were babyface matches? 4? And for what reason? None that I can think of. This was a circumstance where the babyface scenario works. Everybody knew what the match was. No one really wanted to boo either guy. I mean, they were obviously going to back Mark Briscoe the whole time, but by that same token, no one really wanted to boo Lethal here either. And again, once you take away all the shenanigans and the comedy antics at ringside, when you finally get to watch a straight Jay Lethal match for a change, you're like, wow, that guy's pretty good. How easy to forget. And my God, dude, you know, we did the Jay Lethal tribute on last week's podcast. I spent a good amount of time kind of covering that story and going into detail, but even looking back in retrospect, there were so many things that I left out from that conversation. You know, not only did I fail to mention that the day after Jay died, it was Mark's birthday, but I didn't realize that the 25th of January was also Jay's birthday, which is when this Dynamite episode aired. It's just, damn, the more I think about this story, the more tragic it gets. Now, of course, technically Mark and Jay are still the Ring of Honor Tag Team Champions. So they had Mark carry both the belts out here, which was a nice touch. You know, and like I said, they had what mostly ended up being a babyface match. And admittedly, those are extraordinarily difficult positions to pull off in a lot of cases. You know, these two have enough ring experience to know how to make that work. And even so, they didn't hold back from laying into one another here. You know, I mentioned before, go back and check out the Jay Briscoe tribute on last week's show to get more clarity on my experience watching the Briscoes from years ago. But, you know, I wasn't hesitant to talk about it. It took me a long time to sort of grow into them. Their ring style really didn't gel with me for the first few years I watched them. It was very unorthodox, but because it was probably around the same period where Ring of Honor also had those top tag teams like Claudio and Hero, Haas and Benjamin, Davey and Eddie, just a great tag team scene overall. You know, the Briscoes were there too, but in comparison to everybody else, they just never clicked with me for the longest time. And it really wasn't until I started understanding what made them so unique from the rest of the pack to where I started gaining an appreciation for what they did in the ring. Yes, they were unorthodox. Yes, they were very wacky personas, but at no point did I ever think to myself in watching Mark and Jay work matches, these guys are fake, or these guys are clearly playing characters. They were just Mark and Jay Briscoe, man. That's really the nuts and bolts to everything in that conversation. They were their organic, natural selves. When you saw the Briscoes on camera, you were getting the full package. They were a gimmick, plain and simple. But my God, I watch Mark Briscoe in comparison to so much of what I see today. It looks like Ricky Steamboat out there more often than not. But seriously, I mean, they really tore the house down together here. You know, they built everything around the story of Mark trying to hit the Jay Driller on Lethal, and every time the tease came for it, the people popped. They went crazy for it. You know, they did the big table bump at the end, which normally I'd be kind of iffy on, just because we see table bumps every fucking week on this show, and none of them ever mean a goddamn thing. And while I know it's easy for me to sit here and say, well, we can make an exception to the rule here, well, in fact, that's exactly what I'm saying. And it was a great table bump. You know, the big Froggy Bow elbow drop on the timekeeper's table got a big reaction when both guys went through it, looked totally safe. I probably would have advised they go right to the finish at that point instead of getting back in the ring to do a couple more spots before actually setting up the Jay Driller. But, again, the entire premise of the match was Mark doing everything to get that Jay Driller. And when he got Lethal up and spiked him at the end there, 1, 2, 3, big pop. Everyone gave him a standing ovation. I forgot to mention here, at one point the fans were all chanting, "Thank you, Tony." So again, everybody was smarting up to this. We all look back on last week's Dynamite and collectively agree that Tony did not handle that situation to the best of his capabilities. He needed to push harder to get the network to sign off on getting Mark and Jay on camera, at least in some capacity. Beyond the 15-second graphic they threw up at the beginning of the program like WWE always does. They needed an actual tribute. Really, the only thing I can nitpick here is that what happened on this show should have happened last week. But I have no qualms or gripes or grievances about anything else they did here. They also aired that really touching VTR for Jay in hour 1, getting clips of him and his family on there, showing you what kind of down-to-earth great human being the guy was. The common family man. Just your typical blue-collar family man from rural Delaware. That little 2-minute video package depicted everything you needed to know about Jay Briscoe the wrestler and Jay Briscoe the man. For anyone out there that may have not known a whole lot about him, for the people that didn't follow his career and didn't have a whole lot of knowledge beyond what we heard the commentators talk about with last week, or maybe the handful of people that were sort of clued in on some of the tweets that he sent out over a decade ago, the video package explained all of it. It was one of the best jobs AEW's ever done at establishing a talent on camera. And unfortunately, they aired this for a wrestler that's no longer with us. Maybe they ought to try this with like half their goddamn roster more often than not. Maybe I would be able to start giving a shit about more than 2 or 3 guys at a given time. Take the opening of the show as an example of such. It's Chris Jericho and Sammy Guevara versus Ricky Starks and his sidekick Action Audrey. And for everything I said about how the Jay Briscoe video tribute did a phenomenal job in establishing who he was, both as a wrestler and a family man, I am still yet to get any clarity on who this fucking Action Audrey guy is or where he came from. And look, when it comes to the whole Action Andretti thing, I know I intentionally mispronounce his name. Mostly I just do that to piss people off because I know it probably does. But looking at this objectively, trying to put myself in the shoes of a so-called casual viewer, I just keep asking myself the same question every time I see the guy on TV. Who is this guy? What is his backstory? And why should I care? I'm sure from Jericho's point of view, in his fucked up little pea brain, he sees the act of handpicking Action Audrey as him doing good business, trying to, quote, establish young talent and, quote, get them over by association. And I use heavy air quotes around all of that, by the way. And it's one thing to have the guy out there wrestling. He's a good, fine athlete. He can do a lot of athletically impressive shit. Okay, who cares? Out of an entire roster of 300-something guys, 290-something of them do the same fucking thing this guy does. Have they bothered to explain what his story is? We already know the guy can't cut a halfway decent promo to save his life. Look-wise, he's about as generic as they come. Small, frail, plain. Looks no different than the guy that bags my groceries at the supermarket every week. I still want to know why he's friends with Ricky Starks. Wasn't this whole feud initially all about Starks and Jericho? So how and why did Action Audrey get thrown into the middle of this? Because he got a fluke fake win on Chris Jericho several weeks ago? Who cares? And did you notice how lukewarm the crowd was when the heels were getting heat on him? The guy's in there getting worked over, and what are the fans chanting for the entire time? We want Ricky. Not, let's go action, or go action go. The people are going to pop for him because he can do all the athletically cool stuff. He does flips and tumbling routines. So, yeah, obviously the AEW simpletons are going to fawn over him like he's the greatest thing since sliced fucking bread. I mean, those people aren't hard to please anyway. But is he over? Are the people solidly behind him as a wrestler? Is he somebody they would go to bat for to see get a monster push over a guy like Ricky Starks? No. They see him for what he is. A hand-picked placeholder indie guy that Jericho chose to put in here to get in the way of Ricky Starks' push. That's all it is. And if you can't see it any differently, you're either stupid or you're still watching this product with blinders on. So the heels won, predictably. Guevara pinned Action Audrey after they engaged in a bunch of back-and-forth gymnastic stunts for a while. On top of all my other issues with Audrey, the guy's also not a particularly good seller. In the last minute, he not only spikes Guevara with that fucking ridiculous poison Rana that needs to die a horrible death, one of the most rotten, artificially contrived moves we've seen since the fucking Panama Sunrise. I hate them both equally with a passion. And then straight out of that, he gives Guevara some kind of torture rack slam, which looked very indie. And then moments after all that, Guevara just fires back and hits the dude with the GTH and pins him. Flatter than a plate full of piss. It was a case of beating the lesser of two evils, but the only thing I wondered coming out of it was, so you're telling me that the story they're trying to establish is that Action Audrey can beat Chris Jericho clean with no issues, but he can't beat Sammy Guevara after throwing everything but the kitchen sink at him. Seriously, who's booking this? Oh wait, I know the answer. It's Chris Jericho. No wonder it sucks. Oh, and by the way, anyone out there that thought Ricky getting the pin on Jericho 3 weeks ago was going to amount to anything, well, you obviously haven't been paying attention to anything Jericho's been involved with on this show for the better part of 3 years. So following that, they had the Jay tribute package, which I talked about a minute ago. Again, really good stuff. One of the best VTRs they've ever produced. Can't say enough good things about it. And then from there, as is usually the case with AEW, it's straight from the penthouse to the outhouse again, because they can never help themselves. We had another TNT Championship match with Darby Allin defending for the 5th week in a row. This time it is against fellow House of Drek brethren Buddy Matthews, who apparently A, still has a job, and B, is still tied up with Malachi's mangled mess of... Trying to think of a word that starts with M to describe horse shit. Let's just go with that. Y'all know what I'm getting at. And I like how Excalibur is trying to craft this artificial bullshit story about how Darby's working through travel fatigue after being in Japan, how he's had to defend this TNT title 5 weeks straight on Dynamite for reasons that weren't really ever explained. Why? Does Darby have heat with Tony or something? To where he's making Darby defend the title every week on TV because he's a dick? It's hilarious too because we see guys appear and disappear on the show so much. Like a guy wrestles 1 week and we don't see him again for another 8 months, but God forbid, Darby must defend the TNT title for 5 weeks straight because Boss Tony said so. Meanwhile, they're saying the guy's working through jet lag after having been in Japan like a day or two prior. So, of course, he goes out there and does every fucking Darby Allin match we've ever seen. Only difference is he had one of his knees taped up this time. Probably because he legitimately finally hurt himself after doing one of his stupid dives. Finally came back to bite him. And if you're wondering to yourself, how did Buddy Matthews get a title shot when we have not seen him wrestle a single match on TV in well over a year? The answer at this point is, I have no idea, nor do I care. It makes no sense, and if I try to apply logic to this scenario, I'll probably give myself a brain aneurysm. So they're out there kind of doing stuff for a while, floor brawling for about 5 straight minutes, and the ref's just standing around letting it happen, the usual. And in one of the first key angles that takes place here, Darby tries to go up top to give Buddy a coffin drop, and because it's a House of Drex segment, cue the blackout, which at this point has been so overdone in this company alone, now the people just actively groan whenever this bullshit happens. Sure enough, the lights come back on, Malachi and Brody are now posing at the bottom of the ramp in front of Sting, and before they can even do anything, out comes Ortiz with a kendo stick and starts wailing away on Brody King. I wrote down, what the fuck is going on here and why is any of this happening? This was straight out of a Nitro segment where guys are just randomly coming down and appearing and we're all expected to just know what's going on without having been given any prior context to any of it. And I say this right now, if you tell me point blank that I need to watch Rampage to find out what's going on in this situation, you can all lick my butthole. So the ringside brawling, which in an ideal world you would think would be some way to factor into the finish of the match, well, it was a commercial pitch. Malachi, Brody, Sting, and Ortiz all fought to the back. We never saw them again. And they came back from break with Buddy and Darby just doing more shit in the ring. At this point, I wrote down, this is why I actively go out of my way to fast forward through a lot of what happens on this show, because none of it makes a goddamn lick of sense. Or maybe that's just the story of the House of Black and why I gave up trying to care about any of their stuff since the Cody feud. Hard to remember that, by the way, because it happened that long ago, but remember when Malachi Black came in and they immediately put him in a program with Cody? And we all thought he was going to get some monster push out of it? Or that he was going to be one of AEW's top featured guys? So at that point, I walked out of the room for a few minutes to do something. When I came back, I saw Darby give Buddy a poison rana, wherein they both immediately started fighting on the floor again. I said, nope. And I walked out of the room until this atrocity was finished. Darby retained. I don't know how, I don't know when, but all I wrote was, this segment can eat a dick. Oh yeah, and Joe wants his title back. Great. Moving right along here, Hook Boy wrestled again. That's Jungle Boy and Hook, for those that did not hear the show a couple weeks back. They're going by another team name, which I just can't muster up the ability to say without puking in my mouth. They wrestled the other random makeshift team of Ethan Page and Matt Hardy. Speaking of me having no idea what's going on watching the show half the time, can someone bother to explain to me what the hell is going on with this pairing? Why is Matt Hardy all of a sudden bound by contract to be Ethan Page's lapdog? Have they ever explained what happened that led to that point? And if so, why the fuck are they already teasing a split when they never established why the hell they were partners in the first fucking place? In any case, this is another match that I kind of tuned out. You know, I already kind of talked about how I really wasn't digging the whole Jungle Boy Hook team. I don't understand why they feel the need to pair the guys together when they both would probably work better in singles roles. Jungle Boy literally just got done feuding with his former tag partner in Luchasaurus, who, by the way, speaking of guys that randomly disappear from this program, what the hell happened to Christian Cage and Luchasaurus? Anybody know? Well, regardless, they just broke up a tag team that Jungle Boy was involved with, and now they're back to just throwing him back into another tag team. Okay? Why? Especially doing it with Hook, who, again, I just don't think meshes in the tag division. Anything I've ever seen from Hook on this show that I actually enjoy, it's when he's going out there and doing stuff on his own. Beating job guys in short order and putting them away with that red rum finish. The old Taz mission move. In a tag team scene, I just don't really get it. He doesn't stand out. The whole dynamic doesn't really work for me. There were some good workers in this match. I love Hook. I don't have any problems with Ethan Page. You know, Matt Hardy's been overexposed for decades now, but he's always been a solid hand. Jungle Boy is... Well, like I said, I love Hook. But I don't know, man. In this environment, with the way they laid this all out, just didn't click for me, dog. You know, the whole dissension tease with Page and Hardy when they're yet to explain why Hardy is working for Page to begin with, it's just the typical AEW booking problem. The expectation that we, the fans, know what's going on because we either watch every show they produce or read about it on the internet in some capacity. Newsflash, dudes, I have a life. I don't do that shit. Maybe you're basement dwellers that spend their entire life on the internet that watch AEW. Yeah, they probably know what's going on here. But for me, a guy that works 3 jobs and actually has a social life, somewhat, no. I'm not going to go out of my way to read about why Matt Hardy and Ethan Page are working together. Explain it to me on the fucking TV show, you idiots. It's not that goddamn hard. After that, we had this very WWE-inspired sketch with the Acclaimed and the Ass Boys in Family Therapy. And, well, actually, I will use this analogy because I think it's a little more timely. Do you guys all remember when WWE was filming those counseling sessions with Kane and Bryan Danielson back in the day? They were the 2 partners that couldn't get along, so they had like 3 or 4 weeks of television where they were both mandated to go to counseling to work out their problems together. And, you know, they were surprisingly entertaining, but at the same time, you knew it was WWE, so the expectation was that they were going to be hokey and goofy skits. Okay, so imagine that same concept applied here with AEW, except you take out the entertaining part. This is just bad. You know, this is the epitome of not even passing the WWE sniff test. If WWE aired this, it still would have been equally as bad, even with the post-production. It was scripted, it was phony. The only thing I laughed at during it was the line where Max Caster just casually dropped the line about Colton and Austin being pieces of shit. That was at least funny because of the way Caster delivered the line. But everything else about it was just turn the channel bad. And this is coming from somebody that likes both of these teams. Billy Gunn's been great in his role, but I've got to say, when you factor in that this program is being kind of positioned around the tag belts now, that's where you lose me. If the titles are at stake here, I don't want to see AEW filming bad comedy skits with an underneath team. Which, even at this point, are we going to sit here and deny that Austin and Colton are anything beyond that? They're good, solid workers, but they've never been presented as serious main event level guys. And I'm sorry, when you throw the titles into the equation, now the expectation changes. And from the way they've been booked on TV, from the way they've been featured, the Guns are not ready to be in this position. Especially not after watching this debacle. So they got a lot of work to do if they expect me to care about this program. And this did not do a good job in helping matters any. So then at the top of the hour, we had probably one of the more relative surprises on the entire show. Bryan Danielson versus Brian Cage. And I talked about it last week, but if anyone was going to get a halfway watchable match out of Brian the Human Botch Machine Cage, well, Danielson was probably going to be the closest to making that happen. Notice how I didn't say he was going to. Now, before I get into anything here, I will note, I've been fairly critical of the handling in this MJF Danielson title program thus far. I'm still a little unclear on why, if MJF is the one approving Danielson's matches for TV, why he chose two babyfaces to kickstart the whole thing. Again, if the goal is to ensure that Danielson doesn't get a title shot, for a guy like MJF, who's supposed to be sort of a clever, smug heel, he should have been throwing obstacles at Bryan Danielson since day one. Not trying to ease into it or throw him some freebies just to toy around with him. Like, the MJF character should know better. It's a small nitpicky thing, but in the scope of how this program's been laid out, that was sort of a eyebrow-raising decision. Now, the cage match. This was the first time out of the three matches where I actually got the sense they were paying attention to storyline detail. Cage is a big, mean-looking heel, and, while he sounds like a guy sucking helium through a balloon whenever he actually talks, the guy looks physically intimidating. So the story actually made sense where MJF went out of his way to give Cage a bonus pay to rough Danielson up here and injure him. And, while the match had its peaks and valleys, depending on who was in control of things, I would say that by the end, this kind of wound up being how I expected it to go when they announced it last week. It was the best match Cage has ever had in AEW. At the same time, it was probably the worst match Danielson's ever had in AEW. And if you think that comes off as a backhanded comment to Brian Cage, well, that's because it is. The guy's a rotten worker. Everything he does looks like he's executing it underwater. He's a super jacked up looking killer. So naturally, instead of him being a monster heel when he wrestles, he has to go in there and do all of his lucha stuff because he can kind of sort of pull it off. He's strong. I'll give him that. But the way he moves around the ring is like week one in wrestling school level bad. One of the spots they did here was Cage giving Danielson the overhead German from the apron. Danielson came down and landed directly on his shoulder, and he was favoring it throughout the remainder of the match. And it also played into all the post-match stuff they shot afterwards. So this is either Danielson doing the best sell job in history, or he's actually hurt. And in that case, I can only blame whatever moron approved of putting Danielson in the ring with a reckless piece of shit that has no idea what he's doing. All I can say about this match is Danielson tried. Brian Cage works one style of match, and he's basically at the point in his career now where no one's going to be able to smarten him up. So he is what he is. Danielson made the most out of it. Did a fine job working from an underneath roll while Cage was getting the heat on him. And they had the flash roll up at the end where Cage tried to pick up Danielson for the power bomb, but got rolled through and pinned. Wherein immediately after the bell, Cage goes on the attack to Danielson and starts targeting the bad arm again. He ends up posting Danielson on the floor by wrapping his arm around the chair, which then brings out MJF to inflict further damage, at which point I wrote down why. Cage already posted Danielson with a chair. What further damage is there to be done? Yeah, but MJF tries to have Cage hold Danielson down so he can do the stomp spot on the bad arm, but outruns Take-a-Shita for the way too late save. Probably just got done taking a Shita, which accounted for why he showed up so late. And, that was kind of all there was to that post-match angle. And afterwards, Doc Samson was in the training room with Danielson. Renee Paquette's trying to get an idea of Danielson's condition, and Doc is basically saying that he's in no condition to wrestle, and Danielson's basically telling him to go pound sand. And he ends up doing a really good fiery babyface promo. Tells MJF that he's going to take pleasure in stealing the one thing that means the most to him, which is the AEW World Championship, and how nothing and nobody is going to stop him. Up to and including Danielson's opponent for next week's show, the fourth round of Danielson's trial session before the Revolution pay-per-view, Timothy Thatcher. I forgot all about that guy. When was the last time we saw Thatcher? It's been a while. I think when I last saw him, he was still in NXT purgatory. And I've always liked Thatcher's work. Apparently he's been doing some independent stuff over in Japan lately, which is kind of cool. That should be a really fun match, though. And again, keeping with the theme of MJF trying to up the ante with the grungier, more dangerous opponents as the timeline progresses, he's not messing around anymore. Danielson's got 2 more matches to win before he gets that title shot, and if round 4 is Timothy Thatcher, I can only imagine what the final round's going to be. God, I hope it's not Nick Gage. So all in all, it looks like they're doing a little bit of course correcting with all this, which is good. I talked about my complaints with the way they've been handling this feud initially, and now it kind of looks like they're taking charge and actually trying to approach this from a real underdog story. Because now Danielson is going into next week's match with a bad shoulder. And in wrestling a guy like Timothy Thatcher, who's all about the submission mat style of wrestling, he's got that finishing armbar in his arsenal, which they kind of showed in that VTR. So, it's good. If he locks that in on Danielson, it could be all over right then and there. That's the picture they're trying to establish. Hey, imagine that. A fucking storyline. Boy, howdy they do exist. Anyway, moving along here. Trying to wrap this up as best we can. Ruby Riott and Toni Storm had a match. You know the drill. Didn't watch, didn't care, no comment. And then following that was the MJF pre-tape where he set up Danielson's opponent for next week, which we already covered, Timothy Thatcher. I did like his line in here about him conducting the interview from what appeared to be a broom closet. And he actually says, "I'm not the first Jew to have to hide from a man with blue eyes." Yeah. And again, I'm really looking forward to that Danielson-Thatcher match. 2 guys that can actually work, and there's a central story that will play out in that match. On top of everything going on with Danielson's chase to the title, he's also got the kayfabe injury going in. Okay, good. Now I have a reason to care. And then there was the Mark Briscoe Jay Lethal main event, which we already covered at the beginning of the podcast here today. It was a great TV main event. And I wouldn't be surprised to hear that segment did really well in the ratings. If they finished the show strong with holding up at around 1 million viewers or at least somewhere close to it, I wouldn't be shocked. I think the only thing that may have held them back is the fact that they really didn't make any announcements on last week's TV show that the match with Mark Briscoe was ever happening this week. So if people weren't reading about it on the internet to scope out the news, there wouldn't have been any way they would have known about it until the start of Dynamite this week. And they did address it at the top of the program, so I guess even if people tuned out the show with all the nonsense that was going on, they probably came back in droves to at least see the main event. Again, I wish I could say it's likely we see Mark Briscoe on Dynamite again in the future, but it's hard to say. They really had to push to get the approval of either guy being on the show in the first place, so unless this was a favor sort of thing where the executives begrudgingly signed off on it as a one-time deal, this might be the only time we see Mark Briscoe actually work on Dynamite. And for the people that don't have the Honor Club subscription or don't plan on getting one, they really don't have a lot of other ways of finding Mark Briscoe content outside that one platform. unless they watch some of the indie stuff and see him do occasional appearances here and there, which kind of sucks. But at the same time, we can also look at this as a never say never situation. The fact they were able to make this happen gives you signs of hope. Maybe this isn't the last time we see Mark Briscoe on Dynamite. And if that's the case, I think there's an argument to be made that he should get some kind of main event singles push. We know Jay was a former Ring of Honor world champion, but I don't think Mark ever reached that point in his career where he was getting any kind of long-standing main event singles run. I think he could pull it off. There's a real chance to make this guy one of the biggest stars in 2023. And if Tony Khan misses the boat on this one, how often do situations like this ever come up? He's missed golden opportunities before with booking guys. He's screwed the pooch with plenty of talent on this roster. Many of them, in fact. This one's almost a no-brainer. If they got to end up relinquishing the tag belts at some point, you can make a strong case that he ought to be one of the first guys programmed into that Ring of Honor world title picture, especially when they kickstart things on the Honor Club network again and they start producing more content and getting things up and running there. This is the opportune, ample time to do it. If they do, who knows? Perhaps I'll reconsider my decision on refusing to buy a monthly subscription. Guess we'll find out. So I guess we're ready to move on with the rest of the show then. We'll go to the retro portion of today's podcast, my personal favorite part of the Friday show. So this would be NWA World Championship Wrestling from January 24th, 1987. We're a few weeks into the new year, and it's already looking very promising in a lot of cases. We're still a couple months out from the Crockett Cup, but definitely building and hyping up some big-time matches coming up soon. And how's this for an opening teaser? A worldwide wrestling preview of the first ever Ric Flair-Barry Windham televised match. Highlights that we got to see a little later on in the program. This was not the same match from the one they showed the previous week, because I believe that was a non-sanctioned match between the two, which obviously meant that the title wasn't on the line. But right from the gate here, they got you at the hooking point. That was sort of the main seller for the Superstation show this week. And as we cut to solo Tony Schiavone at the booth, before he brought out the first set of guys for his interview, I wrote down the following statement. My God, what was that haircut? It was like right on the brink between him not being able to figure out whether he wanted to go all the way short or keep some version of the mullet. So I guess he went to his barber and said, fuck it, go halfway with it. And thus we got whatever in the hell this hairdo was. It's hair, it grows back. That's always kind of the joke when people get bad haircuts. But I took one look at that thing and said, no. Just awful. Not as awful as Vladimir Petrov, however. How's that for a halfway decent segue? Once again here, going to the well with the visual of trying to film Pietrov's stone face while Uncle Ivan is attempting to cut a menacing foreign heel promo. And much like the last several times they've tried this on television, I just started laughing to myself midway through because the visual is ridiculous. This was extremely funny, though, because during the promo, Ivan's going off on how the Russians slapping Nikita down is like Ivan concurrently slapping down every American across the globe. Be like him reaching through the camera and grabbing the viewers by the scruff of the neck and shaking them up. And while Ivan is delivering all this over-the-top tomfoolery, I'm just watching Pietrov's jaw get wider and wider as the segment goes, waiting for a big old hunk of drool to start running down the side of the guy's mouth. It was just absurd. The whole thing's absurd. This is like their worst attempt at trying to get over a fake foreigner since Boris Zurkov in Mid-South. The least intimidating looking dude portraying a Russian you've ever seen. All the while, I'm supposed to believe that Dusty and Nikita are fucked 6 ways from Sunday whenever they get in the ring with these guys. It's almost as unbelievable and wacky as everything involving handsome Jimmy Valiant. And I'll say this. By the way, he beat Randy Barber in like 15 seconds with an elbow drop. While I know handsome Jimmy isn't around Crockett Promotions for much longer, I'm going to be so sad when he leaves. The stuff he was involved with throughout 86, all the Paul Jones Army crap, albeit for as bad as a lot of it was still one of the more memorable things we covered during that whole period last year. You know, and I know a lot of modern fans would look at his work around that point and think, how could anyone have liked this guy? He was the shits in the ring. Understand, though, Valiant was such a gimmick back in the territory days. Truly, it's like observing it through the lens of someone like a Jay Briscoe. I know they're not remotely compatible in terms of their certain personas, but, you know, there are a bit of comparisons there. Someone that when you saw him on camera, you didn't doubt for a second that the man was being anybody other than Jimmy Valiant. Much like Jay, handsome Jimmy was an extension of his own personality. Everything you saw on camera with him, I would not doubt for a minute that you did not see that same man off camera. Maybe a little bit more filtered, but, you know, for the people out there that talk about things that are missing in wrestling today, the personalities, the larger-than-life gimmicks, the charismatic talents that are able to always hook you in and make you believe in who they are on camera. Always remember just how important Jimmy Valiant was to the business. Even if the guy couldn't wrestle his way out of a wet paper bag, I'll grant you that. I never said the guy was a good wrestler. And I don't even think handsome Jimmy would look at his work around this point and say that he was all that good. But I still think wrestling needs these kinds of workers again. Especially if the goal is to draw in casual viewers and try to make the product at least remotely watchable from week to week. MJF can't carry the load by himself. Just saying. And for those of you that don't believe me, that you think I'm blowing smoke up your rear, here's how fucking great Jimmy Valiant was. He managed to make a Tim Horner interview segment one of the most entertaining things on the entire program. Ironically enough, not for anything Horner said, because he nearly put me into a self-induced coma with his promo here. I don't remember anything he said. Something about forming a unit with Brad Armstrong and Barry Windham going up against the Horsemen. But it's like a snap of a finger, dude. As soon as Valiant gets in there and starts bubbling up the promo with his over-the-top antics, he flipped this thing around in a hurry. He gave good old White Lightning a little bit of personality for a minute or two. Told Tony that there's finally someone in Crockett Promotions that's more good-looking than him. He mentioned how during this time of the season where it's rainy and cold and damp and gloomy, in his heart and Timmy's heart, it's sunshine, baby. Even Mr. Eeyore Horner himself cracked a smile there for a little bit. And he also said that it was National Grandpa Day, which I guarantee you is a thing he made up on the spot with very little forethought. And here on the Saturday Night Superstation in 1987, Jimmy Valiant took approximately 60 seconds of airtime to put over all the grandpas across the world, up to and including his own, who apparently turned 93 that day. Then he concluded by saying that him and Horner are going to go to the airport to do some circling of the airport. Also making sure to plant a kiss on Horner before they cut away, which Horner looked none too pleased to be partaking in. And I noted after all this, if Tim Horner actually got a plane ticket to travel with Handsome Jimmy, why did no one ever bother to take a camera crew to film that? Talk about missed opportunities. Anyway, coming back from break, we had Brad Armstrong out at the booth to sort of recap a situation that happened between him and the Horsemen on NWA Pro. And we'll talk about the video shortly and explain everything that went down. But I did note during this initial promo here with Tony, he said that the Armstrong family is like a fine watch. It'll take a licking, but it'll keep on ticking. To which I then said, so are the Armstrongs secretly into licking fetishes? That might have been one of the weirdest similes I've ever heard in my life. Now, the actual pre-tape with Flair and Brad was pretty great. You know, Brad's in the middle of a scheduled interview when Flair waltzes over and interrupts him. Says that Brad is actually impeding on his interview time. So he tries to get him to piss off, but Brad stands his ground and starts getting into a verbal jousting match with Flair. And Flair's trying to ignore Brad and cut a promo on Dusty, but Brad won't go away. And he finally stands up to him and says that he may not be able to match Ric Flair on the microphone, but he can damn sure wrestle circles around him in the ring. And at the point things are really getting heated between these two, in come the rest of the Horsemen to jump Brad from behind, and they wind up dropping him gut first across the top of a folding chair before the rest of the babyfaces empty out of the locker room to save him. And while on the surface, this probably doesn't seem all that eventful, given how many times we see dudes getting jumped and laid out in mass brawls in today's product, the interaction here between Brad and Flair was so damn good. It was such a natural delivery from both guys. You know, Flair's being a cocky world champion, trying to cut Brad off at the knees and belittle him at every turn. Brad is a total believable, sympathetic babyface that stood up to a top guy and gave him a bit of a tongue lashing before getting blindsided by the rest of the heels. You know, like I said, it just came off like a natural altercation between a really down-to-earth good guy and a smug, mean bad guy. Brad did nothing wrong here. He was told to come out and cut a promo, but Flair got in there and tried to steal the promo away from him because he's a jerk, basically. You know, figuring Brad was going to walk away and not do anything about it. But Brad stood up to him, you know, and because Brad's green and doesn't know any better, he pays for it in the end by getting jumped by the veterans. Made you really want to see Brad get his hands on Flair for being an outright douchebag for no reason. But at least there's a reason to see these guys fight now. You know, at least I know who the good guys and the bad guys are in this situation. Maybe AEW ought to take notes. 45 seconds of camera time this got. And I now have a reason to cheer one guy and boo the other guy. It ain't that fucking hard. So then we went to the ring for Dick Murdoch and Baron Von Raschke versus Brody Chase and Larry Stevens. Because this is still a thing, apparently. The random makeshift pairing of the Baron and Captain Redneck on TV because, I don't know, couldn't think of anything else to do with them, I guess. And I like how after one time of seeing the two team together, Tony Schiavone is already talking about how they should be in consideration for tag team gold down the road. I'm like, they've been a team for 2 weeks, Tony. Calm down. So Murdoch went with the Brainbuster, wherein we immediately went to the booth for a quick post-match interview where the Baron referred to the Crockett Cup as the, quote, World Cup. Says that him and Captain Redneck are gearing up for all the competition and they want to win it all. And then Murdoch took a couple minutes to plug the upcoming towns they'll be visiting soon. Also making note to Tully Blanchard in the ring that he's got a bone to pick with him down the road. He wants a shot at the TV title and the 10 grand. Which promptly led us directly into Tully defending the title against Zane Smith, who I believe last week on the show was getting killed by Vladimir Pietrov and left for dead in the middle of the ring. Somehow they decided he was worthy of a TV title shot here, much less $10,000. So naturally, Tully proceeded to kick his ass for about 2 minutes and then pin him with the slingshot. And from there, we went directly to the highlights of the Windham Flair match from the worldwide taping. Windham was out here at the booth with Tony wearing a camel-colored peacoat. I wrote down, must have been freezing inside the studio when they were filming this. It was a nice coat. But they cut to about the 25-minute mark of the match, and Dusty and Tony are obviously calling the action here on the taping. And right around this point, they were about midway through the heat portion. Both guys were pretty exhausted now. They're both sweating profusely. Pretty soon, Barry starts attempting to make an early comeback, but Flair immediately goes to cut him off and traps him in the figure four. And they work through a series of spots where Flair keeps cutting Windham off before he can really milk any offense. And they're basically playing up the story that Barry would keep getting some occasional hope spots, but every time Barry was on the verge of taking control, he'd have one little misstep to where Flair would be able to gain the advantage again. And, that plays into the story of Barry being inexperienced. His first time going up against Ric Flair for the top belt, so there were a lot of learning curves that he would have to overcome during their rivalry. Made sense. I love hearing Dusty go into fan mode during his commentary where Barry would finally be able to hook in the figure four on Flair, and Dusty would just keep going, "Lock it in, baby, lock it in, lock it in." Or moments later, him telling Barry to stay in control by going, "Be aggressive, baby, you gotta be aggressive, daddy." God, I love Dusty. I also believe this was the first time I had ever heard anybody refer to chop exchanges as popping leather. Maybe that was only a Dusty thing, but he wasn't entirely off base. I never thought about the fact that it does sound like people slapping leather. But, well, they cut to a commercial during this, so they come back from break, and that's around the point where they did the ref bump spot with Tommy Young. Windham ended up taking advantage and hitting Flair with a somewhat off-kilter missile dropkick. And by that, I basically mean he missed. But he got an ear fall off that, even though Flair was basically down for a 10 count. And they start building up to the crunch time deal where Tom Miller, the ring announcer, is counting down from the final 5 minutes. Some really great false finishes at the end where the people pop when Barry would have Flair in a pinning predicament. Both guys are really showing the fatigue by now. And once we get down to the gut check portion of the match, Dusty had completely given up trying to call this match as an unbiased ring announcer. He was solely in the camp for Barry Windham. And just as Barry is able to deck Flair with the lariat off the ropes, he crawls over to cover the champ, and they do the photo finish where Tommy Young goes to count 1, he goes to count 2, and right before he can hit that mat for the 3rd count, bell rings. And it's determined that the match is a draw. So while Barry's in there holding up the world title and contemplating whether or not he's going to leave with the belt anyway, he goes over to grab the microphone from Tony Schiavone at ringside, and he tells everybody that someday he'll be world champion. And when that day comes, he'll walk out of the ring holding the title. But obviously, his time isn't now. And it's such a heart-wrenching moment because in the back of your head, you're like, fuck. Barry was so close. Had it not been for that time limit draw. But even the visual of seeing him hold the title in his hands for a few seconds, you're like, man, when the day comes when he finally wins that thing, it's going to look so good around his waist. And he cut the exact kind of babyface promo he should have. You talk about it so often. One of the worst things a good guy can do is promise to become a world champion and then not live up to his word in the end. So, even back when people weren't really smartened up to the business, you look at a promo like this and think, well, Barry better win that world title at some point. Otherwise, this promo is going to turn him into the biggest fucking heel in the history of wrestling. So that was good. Of course, we get that classic Horseman promo in the heel locker room where they're all yucking it up over the fact that Flair's still the champion. By the skin of his teeth, he escaped. But Flair tells Barry that there's winners and losers in this business, and the winner is the guy still holding the title. He says there are 50 girls outside their locker room right now waiting to plow the winners. Meanwhile, Barry's sitting with his head cupped in his hands. A loser. And they did the signature Horseman huddle and shouted, all for one and one for all. And every man for himself. I threw in that last line there. Maybe you'll get the reference if you enjoy 1940s sitcoms. And meanwhile, the hits just keep on coming with the good stuff. We had JJ, Arn, and Tully out. And first things first, JJ's got to put over the significance of what it's like to not only come out each and every night, not only defend your reputation, but also being able to put up $10,000 of your own hard-earned money to do so. For all the doctors and lawyers out there, can't say they have the ability to do it all that often. And I must also point out, last week on the show, I was almost certain that JJ was flaunting fake money when he was on camera. Maybe it was the lighting or the way they went about filming everything. This week I was not so sure. While it is entirely possible these were all fake $100 bills that JJ had wrapped in one of those sleeves, because of the fact that it is the Horseman, honestly, you can't really ever be sure. I would not have put it past Tully and JJ to go to the bank, withdraw $10,000 of their own money, just to use it in a segment for NWA. That would actually be the most unsurprising thing I would ever expect the Horsemen to do. And Tully added a little bit to the promo, covering all that goes into being a member of the Horsemen. The fact that all four guys eat, sleep, breathe, and shit being a Horseman night in and night out. That was more so a PG-13 way of explaining it. Tully was a little more classy in his delivery. But, kind of the main takeaway from all this is JJ putting over Lex Luger and kind of reiterating the talking point from last week, saying he's got a lot of potential, but with the current assembly of Ole, Arn, Tully, and Flair, they're not looking to expand members right now. And notice how he explicitly said, expand. He did not say, replace. Very subtle detail there, but very important for where this is all going. And speaking of the total package, he was in action next. Luger versus Randy Mulkey. 1 week removed from them feeding Randy Mulkey to the TV champion. Now they're throwing him at greener than goose shit Lex Luger. Or wait, now that I think about it, wasn't it Bill Mulkey that wrestled Tully last week? I can still never tell the two apart. And I know they're identical twins, that's the gimmick, but you'd think after a while of watching these guys wrestle, I would at least be able to distinguish a little bit of difference between the two. To this day, I still can't. But Luger killed him in about a minute, one with the rack. Still not a move that was quite over with the fans yet, so no one popped for it. Took a little bit of time to establish that, but they eventually got there with it. The important detail for this segment was the angle with JJ whispering something into Luger's ear on the ring apron after the match. Also shaking his hand right before they cut to Luger's interview with Tony. And Tony, of course, ever the opportune journalist, looking to journalize all over the place to figure out what JJ and Luger were discussing. And I got to be honest with you, I tried, but Luger was so blown up during this promo, I could not make heads or tails of more than half of what he said. Something about his phone blowing up with all the major television producers across the country. Something about him being one of the hottest commodities in the business today. And something about him never wanting to settle for complacency, which is why he wants to be a horseman. I also loved his line in here where he mentioned something about liking their financial statements. To which I said, did Luger go through the Horsemen's financial reports just to see how much income they made? How did Crockett let that pass? Isn't that confidential information? Unless they were willing to disclose it with him. Pinky to the lips there. Well, in any case, Barry Windham is still frustrated that Luger is trying to sell out by becoming a member of the Horsemen. Tells him he's making the biggest mistake of his life. Once again, though, Luger is not having any of this. He tells Barry that he's sick of him interrupting his interview time and that if he does it again, they're going to have a problem. And then Barry just tells Luger that if he insists on being a Horseman, that's fine. But eventually he's going to find himself standing across the ring from him. So this little side story is blossoming very well. It is oddly amusing hearing Luger talk about how someday it's Barry that'll come to his senses and understand the financial gains of what it's like to be a horseman. All the while I keep thinking, isn't that sort of an unwritten rule in wrestling where the heels aren't supposed to be proven right in the end? Because fast forward a year later on television, and no, Luger wasn't exactly wrong in his prediction. Just throwing it out there, you know. So up next, with the Road Warriors out for a quick promo, Animal's pissed off that nobody's stepping up to the plate to answer the Road Warriors open challenge from a few weeks ago. Tells the Horsemen that if they have any guts, they'll step up and face off with the Legion of Doom, Dusty, and Nikita. To which I asked, didn't they already show highlights of that match happening on an NWA Pro taping? I could have sworn they already did that match because I remember David Crockett was talking about how it was the greatest moment in wrestling history. And meanwhile, the only thing they showed were the ring entrances. Hawk also took Luger to the promo woodshed here momentarily. Said that he's so concerned about financial security when the only thing he should be concerned about is the moment he steps into the ring with the Road Warriors. Because after they're done with him, he's going to wind up in a box 10 feet under the ground. And then he went into some iteration of how many slugs could a slugger slug if a slugger could slug slugs montage. I basically just wrote down, Hawk bitch that everybody in the NWA was a slug. Because this seems to be the only noun in the dictionary that Hawk can find to describe people that are afraid of the Legion of Doom. That and weasels. Even though last time we saw a weasel shirt on TV, it was misspelled. That was all there really was to the promo, though. Oh yeah, and Tony Schiavone with perfect product placement by giving Paul Ellering a personalized copy of the Starrcade 86 VHS tape. Now available for purchase. And if I did not enunciate that well enough, let me repeat that for those of you watching. VHS tape. Cassette. You know those little rectangular things that used to go in VCRs? Good God, these shows are outdated. Coming back for the top of the hour, we had Brad Armstrong versus Gary Royal. And here's everything I wrote down about it, but I'll elaborate on why this left me baffled at the end. Way too competitive match. Brad won with the leg sweep. Now, on the surface, you'd probably think, well, what's wrong with Brad Armstrong having a moderately competitive TV match with an underneath jobber? Well, under normal circumstances, there probably would not have been any problem with it. However, On this show, they literally just got done showing a pre-tape in the first hour where Brad had a face-to-face confrontation with World Heavyweight Champion Ric Flair. And they're doing everything to get you anticipating the idea of a Brad Armstrong, Ric Flair program down the road. Title or non-title, it doesn't matter. For this time, especially, probably felt like a big deal for Brad Armstrong. So, an hour later, I'm watching Brad Armstrong struggle to beat Gary Royal. I mean, it's one thing to give the guy a couple hope spots, but this match went almost like 4 or 5 minutes. It was almost a 50-50 back and forth match. There were large portions of this where Gary Royal was in complete control. And this is probably the smart fan in me talking, like, why am I supposed to get amped about the possibility of seeing Armstrong wrestle Flair when he can barely beat Gary fucking Royal in under 5 minutes? And that's not the shit on Gary Royal. I mean, I don't have anything against the guy personally. From what I've seen of him on the studio shows, he's a moderately competent worker. He's sure better than a lot of the eggheads we've seen that couldn't wrestle a good match if their life depended on it. But, this is just weird. For my money, watching Brad Armstrong struggle to beat Gary Royal on TV did not entice me to see him go toe-to-toe with Ric Flair at any point. But, again, perhaps that's just a smart Mark talking. Following that, we had Ricky Morton and Robert Gibson's hairy shoulder out for a promo. The random patch of hair on Gibson's shoulder was very noticeable and grotesque. He basically just called out Manny and Rick Rude, said that eventually they would make a mistake and lose their world tag belts back to the Rock and Roll Express. Funny enough, I said to myself, well, yeah, they definitely made a mistake. The mistake was Dusty putting the belts on them in the first place, thinking they weren't going to walk out of the company with them and never give them back. What I wanted to talk about here, moreover, was David Allen Coe and that fucking hair. Whew. I thought my hair was too long once upon a time. Good Lord Almighty, this man's hair. That was right about the length where I don't even want to know the man's struggles when he had to take a shit. There's like 3 kinds of long hairstyles that I've seen. There's neck length, there's shoulder length, and then there's what I call Gandalf length, where your hair is basically drooping down so far below your butt, I don't even know how that's comfortable in most cases. I don't know a lot of women that have their hair that long. And for those of you asking yourself, who in the fuck is David Allen Coe, and you're not attuned to the music scene, well, Google it, more or less. The nutshell summary is that he is an American country songwriter and guitarist. As of 2023, he's still alive. He is 83 years old. Wow. Now, I personally never listened to any of his album work, but I know one of his childhood inspirations was Johnny Ace. So if you're into the whole country music scene, I guess you kind of know what you're getting if you know Johnny Ace's work. No, I don't mean the Johnny Ace you're probably thinking of. Not John Laryngitis. I'm talking about John Marshall Alexander. Anyway. Well, as you'd probably expect, Coe's promo was beyond fucking rotten. He did his best WWE impression of, I'm going to recite a bunch of pre-planned verbiage in the most unconvincing manner. He banked on Ricky and Robert winning their titles back. And then he told Ric Flair to watch his back because he is banking on Dusty getting the gold again. And, well, he's probably still banking on that to this day. Because that never happened. So that segment was pretty bad. Then we had Dusty and Nikita out for a promo. Nikki addressed Uncle Ivan and Vladimir Pietrov, as well as the Horsemen. Basically, he said that he's sick of all the heels running roughshod over everybody. As for Pietrov, if he ever decides to get in the ring with nephew Nikita, he'll make sure that he's in for the fight of his life. And Dusty kind of recapitulated a lot of what he said last week when it came to Ivan bringing in Pietrov to specifically go after Nikita. Talked about how Nikita chose the path of freedom by siding with the superpowers. And there was something in here about Dusty and Nikita traveling on a private jet with Little Richard. And I'll admit, I have absolutely no idea what the hell Dusty was rambling on about. Facetiously, I wrote down, Dusty was doing very well and making sense for the first half of this promo, and then it totally went off the rails in the last minute. But that's Dusty for you. The classics. Then we had the Rock and Roll Express beating David Isley and Eddie Roberts with the double drop kick. Pretty much all there is to say about that. Which is very apropos for a rock and roll squash. Immediately, we went to the booth for some more great promo work. Superstar Bill Dundee and gorgeous Jimmy Garvin were being their over-the-top wacky selves. Dundee re-informing us that he's bringing in the Barbarian to Crockett Promotions after he's done touring in the Central States region. Allegedly, he's been such a commodity to places like Lexington, Louisville, Nashville, and all the central regions of the country. Jim Crockett had personally acquired his own personal jet to fly him over there to wrestle the toughest competition in the area. And then Garvin delivered what I chalked up to as the I am coming up with everything I am saying on the spot promo. One of the first things he said was that he's been waiting an hour and 20 minutes to come out and slap somebody in the face, to which I wondered, well, who's stopping you in the meantime? And, I don't know. Beyond that, he just talked about how he and Dundee were thinking about attending Coast Performance in Richmond later on, but they have more important things to do. And the only other thing of note was Gorgeous Jimmy having Precious kiss Tony on the cheek for some odd reason. After which I thought, has there been anybody that's gotten more action than Tony Schiavone on these studio shows? So many people want to kiss Tony for whatever reason. I don't know what to make of that. Between a kiss on the cheek from Precious versus getting mouth-to-mouth from Jimmy Valiant a week ago, I don't know about that. I might have to flip a coin. While I simmer on that for a while, let's talk about Manny Fernandez and Rick Rude versus Tommy Angel and Chance McQuaid. Moreover, let's talk about how fucking stupid the name Chance McQuaid is. You know, we talked about this last week too. Think about all the job guys that are arbitrarily changing their names on these studio shows for whatever reason. Somehow, nobody thought yet to change the name Chance McQuaid. He'd be better off going with Flippy McGillicuddy. The only other thing I wrote down here was the epic finish recovery from Bull and Rude. I think they were on completely separate pages because they go to whip Angel off the ropes. And on the way back, they attempt this double team spot where Bull tries to catch him with a knee to the gut, and Rude just didn't really do anything except grab him with his arms. So in the best audible moment of Rude's entire career, he just went, all right, fuck it. I got the guy close enough. I'm just going to DDT and pin him. And he did. It was the finest, messiest finish of all time, I determined. As was the post-match promo, but it was more so just messy and not in a good way. They're still claiming to be the only R&R connection in the NWA. Paul Jones said that Bull and Rude do not sing at any other time except for when they're on their way to the bank to deposit their checks. That was actually a good line. Rude said something about how he and Bull have all the credentials in the tag division because they have the top belts. He also quoted a very cringeworthy poem where he said, almost a direct quote, Bull and Rude in Atlanta, GA are going to embarrass the Road Warriors the ravishing way. And I probably butchered the hell out of that line, but it was so bad, I couldn't even force myself to go back to listen to it a second time. It was also during this promo where I determined Manny Fernandez was the quintessential definition of a guy that looked like he was run through a razor blade factory. The forehead scarring on this man. Fucking putrid. Seriously, he looked like he was about to bleed just by screaming. I was afraid he was going to start gushing blood purely by standing there. Ugh. Don't do blade jobs, kids. Just stay away from it. It was almost as disgusting as Vladimir Pietrov wrestle. Are my segues just golden? I really do try. I do my best. Anyway, he beat Alan Martin. It was slightly less horrible than the 30-second squash he worked last time. Although he did somehow manage to gain a pinfall while holding an illegal choke on the guy. I think that was just Scrappy McGowan saying, fuck it, let's just get through this as painless as possible. He looked down and said, well, the shoulders are on the mat. Good enough for me. Count that pin and get out of there. They also did a post-match promo with him and Ivan, where the only thing I wrote down was, Pietrov managed to not breathe through his mouth at any point. I call that progress. It's baby steps, people. Baby steps. Maybe Jim Cornette could have given him a hand. And I'm not just saying that because he was out for a promo next. See, I told you, my segues are flawless. Anyway, he came out and shamed Tony Schiavone for giving Paul Ellering the Starrcade 86 tape. Said that anybody that purchases a copy of that tape to see Cornette get hospitalized is a sicko. He claimed that he would personally see it fit that he gets that tape taken off the market. At which point I wrote, I wonder if Jim Cornette could have actually weaseled his way into a court hearing to validly get Starrcade 86 removed from stores. Part of me thinks he could. That guy could talk his way through anything. Especially if he had Stephen P. New representing him as an attorney. Talk about vignettes that I would pay to get my hands on. So promptly that led directly into the six-man tag. Midnight Express and Big Bubba wrestled the most random three-man pairing of job guys I think I've seen yet. They basically looked around and said, who have we not used on this set of tapings yet? Denny Brown, Bill Mulkey, and George South. That'll work splendidly. A pretty fine little match, all things considered. I was more so fixated on Corny dropping the line of the century here, where at some point in the match, he just outright decided that Tony Schiavone is the biggest loser on the face of the planet. It began with him berating Tony for having no idea what was going on in the ring. And then he somehow turned that up to 1,000,000 by saying that Tony has the ugliest kids in the world. I'm like, way to get real personal quick, huh? And for the record, Jim Cornette predicting Schiavone's run in AEW 30-something years early. The fact that he has no idea what's going on and never has anything constructive to say when he's talking on Dynamite. Pretty much the epitome of everything I've ever seen Tony involved with on that show. At least in 1987, they let Tony hold the microphone when guys got to do their interviews. The last minute of the match was the greatest finish to a TV squash I've seen yet. Of course, having Bill Mulkey be the sacrificial lamb and everything. Starting with the heels deciding to play a game of power slam roulette with Mulkey and continually tagging in and out so they could keep dropping him. And then right at the very end, the Midnights double Irish whip Mulkey off the ropes so they can elevate him overhead into Bubba's arms. Also, he could catch him mid-air in a pile driver position and then spike him with a powerbomb for the pin. Now, I have seen Barbarian and Meng do that exact same spot as the Faces of Fear in WCW. Yes, it was equally as great. I did not figure they were brave enough to actually let Big Bubba Rogers try that spot. Especially when you factor in how green he was by this point still. I'm just putting myself in Bill Malky's shoes. Would I trust Big Bubba to catch me upside down after getting thrown overhead like that? I mean, I guess if it's Bobby Eaton and Dennis Condrey that were flipping me over or rotating me, then maybe. But for Big Bubba, it's like, dude, if you fucking drop me here, that is the end of my life as I know it. So as God is my witness, you better fucking catch me. And he did. Hats off to Big Bubba, man. That guy was supremely talented. And strong. And the Midnights did a quick follow-up promo here where Corny's basically promising that they were going to end Ron Garvin's career next time they see him. More of the same stuff we've been hearing him talk about for a while. At this point, I'm kind of ready to just see the angle because I'm done anticipating it. I'm kind of over it. I mean, this stuff has kind of been going on for a while, to be fair. And for our main event, Arn Anderson wrestled Big Bill Tab. Yes, after one trial period of having him go by William Tab, they reverted back to Bill Tab a week later. Definitely a more fitting ring name. They went a couple minutes, and surprisingly, Arn got the win with the Double-A Spinebuster. He did not use the Gourdbuster for a change. Now, we've seen him use the Spinebuster on and off for TV, but I don't think we've yet to see him use it as a finish yet. So this might have been right around the point he started to utilize the Spinebuster as a finish. Best Spinebuster in the business, by the way. Don't ever forget that. And in one of the more popcorny fart ways they've ended the shows recently, Lex Luger was back out for a promo to once again reassure us that he will be a member of the Horsemen. He mentioned a few other things here under his breath that were borderline inaudible. It was one of those, I believe some of the words he spoke were of English tongue, although I cannot really piece them all together in the proper order. And it really wasn't anything we already hear or didn't hear Luger cover before. They're still trying to figure out the whole interaction with him and JJ from earlier on. And that's kind of where they left it. A big old cliffhanger. So hopefully we get some answers soon because it looked very intriguing. All in all, I'd say this was an up and down show. Peaks and valleys throughout, but you know, the one thing you'll always hear me say with these NWA shows, I will take moderately boring but well-constructed television over the crash TV schizophrenic as fuck shows any day of the week. I'm too old to be watching more than one or two wrestling programs weekly that make little to no sense in the booking. My cap is with Dynamite and SmackDown. My expectation is that those shows are going to suck more often than not, but at least when I tune in to watch the retro shows, even if the booking is generic and dull a lot of the time, at least I can say that I know what's going on more than 50% of the time. Which kind of dovetails us into this episode of World Class. Like I just said, generic booking, dull booking, but at least there's a shred of coherency to what goes on most weeks. At least I know when I tune into an episode of World Class, I'm going to get Bill Mercer referring to the missing link as a strange apparition. God, that never gets old. I also liked in his opening montage, he asks the fans if we remember the time General Skandar Ogbar lit a fireball in the face of the Iceman and tried to end his career. And of course my answer was, yes, Bill. You've replayed that on television for like 6 weeks in a row. The fucking guy working the customer service booth at Walmart knows about the time the Iceman got a fireball to the face. I know. I'm being a dick. I'm salty. What can I say? That's why I don't have a lot of friends. So we'll talk about the sixth man later on, because that was sort of what the main show was built around for the card. First, we got an encore presentation of the Kamala Junkyard Dog TV match from one of the more recent tapings they did. A match that was blow for blow, toe to toe, and choke for choke, according to Bill Mercer. That's actually not too bad. I could see that on a t-shirt. And to be honest, I would say this match was more squeeze for squeeze and nerve hold for nerve hold, if I were trying to provide a pure, candid analysis of it. Now, because it was an encore presentation, that means we've already covered this match at length on one of the previous retro recaps. I wish I could take the time to dig up the date, but I don't think they ever threw up a graphic to show when the match was originally taped. But I know we've discussed it. I mean, it was a JYD match, so he was already making rare appearances in Dallas to begin with by this point. I remember it because we did a little bit of a tirade on JYD's conditioning around this point in his career. It wasn't quite totally phoned in JYD, but man, we were getting close. I mean, his physique was already starting to wane pretty considerably by now. But, he had been doing the on and off thing with Kamala for quite a while, actually. I remember they were doing work in Mid-South way before this. It might have been sometime as far back as like 82 when they were being programmed together in Watts' territory. So they had history going back even then. And again, you take into account the talents here. The quality of the match is going to be highly dependent on what you would classify as good quality wrestling. The crowd pretty much ate up anything JYD did. And the satisfying payoff came when Dog got his hands on Akbar and Friday and laid them out, as well as Kamala. Yeah, everything else that happened in between was just kind of void filler until we got to that point. But again, if you want to hear me elaborate more on that match, you can try to go back in the archives and listen to the recap from several weeks ago if you can figure out what show that was on. I don't even remember at this point. Really, though, you didn't miss a whole lot outside of what I briefly summarized here. Unless you want to go out of your way to hear my 30-minute escapade on Junkyard Dog's run from like 82 to 84, mostly talking about the downfall. Again, I've gone back and watched a lot of those Mid-South tapes in the last 5 or 6 years. It's almost sad to think what happened to Dog's momentum in just that 2-year time frame. But, well, speaking of trips down memory lane, things we've already covered at length, remember that time Fritz, Kevin, Carey, and Mercer went duck hunting in the countryside? Makes me really regret not taking advantage of things like that when I was in my youth years. I did a little bit of fishing here and there, but I don't know, I was never into the whole hunting thing. My dad never owned any guns to begin with, and it was just never one of those hobbies my family ever got into. But I'll tell you, you go back and watch them putting together minute-long VTRs of the Von Erichs going hunting in the woods, spending the day hanging out as a family. Good times. Sure as fuck beats TikTok. Or whatever the young folks are into today for hobbies. OnlyFans. I heard that's a thing a lot of people engage in. Sounds about right for where we are as a culture in 2023. We've gone from super strong, masculine boys enjoying activities like fishing and hunting, weight training, all kinds of sports and all the good stuff that made men men. We've gone from that to friggin' social media influencers and TikTok vloggers. God, no wonder I don't have any friends. Or social media. From there, though, we went to a Mike Von Erich versus Ron Cheatham match at the Sportatorium. One of the first times we've seen Mike wrestle since the Freebirds match at the Star Wars show in December. This match actually had one of the more fun comedic heel spots we've seen in a while. They did the old thing where Cheatham tried to do the cocky pose while standing on the second and first rope. And while he has his back turned to Mike, he ends up eating a drop kick from behind. And they do the whole thing where he gets hung up in the ropes like a pretzel and gets his ankles twisted so he's stuck in a prone position. All the while, there's David Manning, all 140-something pounds of him, trying to pry the ropes apart to free the guy. Failing miserably, by the way, which made the whole thing that much more perfect. This was actually a very well-executed spot, too, because Cheatham did about 3 or 4 rotations in the ropes before actually getting caught up. And when they showed it in slow-mo, I got a chuckle out of it. Now, of course, we've already sort of done the deep dive into Mike Von Erich's career, at least the overview portion. Out of all the members of the Von Erichs, including the fake ones like Waldo and Lance, I would say that Mike probably ranked among the worst of the bunch, sadly enough. To be fair, Chris never really got a fair shake because of how small he was, so, I mean, he never even really got a chance. Mike was just sort of an unfortunate case of watching curdled milk when he was on TV. You know, the one thing about the brothers in particular, obviously I'm talking about Kerry, David, and Kevin, all of them had unique qualities that helped mask any of their inefficiencies. Whether it was the promo stuff, the look, the size, the ability in the ring. You know, they all at least excelled in one or more of those categories. But Mike just didn't really have any of those qualities, unfortunately. Probably the best thing he had going for him out of all those categories was the look, and even so, it really wasn't all that great to begin with. And to be fair, he could do some stuff in the ring. Like, he was mildly competent when it came to the basics and fundamentals. And for the most part, he did the babyface selling thing pretty well. You know, he had some good facials when he was in Jeopardy and fighting from underneath, but blech. Like I said, just the epitome of watching paint dry when he was in the ring otherwise. And again, that's no fault of his own. He just didn't have the it factor. And they really didn't learn their lesson with the Mike experiment early on, because they were going to keep forcing that guy on TV no matter what. So I'll tell you, if you aren't already sick of Mikey by now, get ready, because the push only furthers from here. And at some point, we're not even going to be calling it a push. We're going to be calling it a force, because that's what it'll be. It'll be Mike Von Erich crammed up, down, and inside and outside your sphincter. So get ready for it. Then coming back from break, we had Jim Garvin going up against Chief White Cloud. Garvin, who was admiring himself in a handheld mirror beforehand. Right out of the playbook of Paul Orndorff. And if we were wondering to ourselves whether or not Chief White Cloud was a blood relative of Wahoo McDaniel and or Chief Jay Strongbow, the answer was, based on the ring capabilities, I would say probably not. He had some of the worst arm drag takeovers I think I've ever seen. His wacky Indian dance was also very unfitting and hard to watch at times. As expected during this match, more chance for Sunshine, who did not make an appearance here, despite making one in the main event six-man with Chris Adams. I mean, the match had its moments, but generally it wasn't anything to write home about. I figured this was just going to be like a short squash deal to put Garvin over, but not only did they have the match go almost 7 full minutes, but the finish is Precious gouging White Cloud's eyes while he had Garvin in a weird-looking figure four. So it was a DQ finish, which they called about 2 minutes late. What happened was, he has Garvin in the figure four, and while they're near the ropes, Precious reaches in and starts grabbing at White Cloud's face. And while Bronco goes out to basically pull her away, he does not directly call for the bell. He just goes out to admonish her. Don't put your hands on them. So like another full minute goes by, and when Bronco gets in the ring, Mark Lorenz just rings the bell and signals the end of the match. I was like, the fuck? That was odd. But yeah, despite the run-in from Precious, no Sunshine, no Adams, the heels just took the L and left. I was like, you had to give Chief White Cloud an outing? I mean, unless the guy's going to be a recurring underneath guy on TV, which in that case, okay. I wasn't all that impressed with him from what I saw here, but maybe that's because I was watching him wrestle Jimmy Garvin, who's on a totally different playing field. Much like the participants in the main event six-man, it's Kerry Von Erich, the Iceman, and Chris Adams with Sunshine going up against the Super D's and the, quote, strange and unusual missing link. He also missed the strange and unusual apparition, the missing link. Come on, Mark. That's a given. Now, considering the participants involved, the central story was mostly revolved around the Iceman and the Super D's. And I like how Bill Mercer set up to ensure us of this was by mentioning how the Iceman will more than likely never forgive Skandar Akbar and his crew for throwing a fireball in his face. He was just so casual about it. As if to say, probably not an occasion where they'll be able to hash things out over a cup of coffee. Gee, man, sorry we threw a fireball in your face. Things got a little out of hand there for a minute. You think? Now, this match did get a lot of time, so there was a good amount that happened here. First 5 minutes was a pretty paint-by-numbers babyface domination. Everyone sort of ran wild on the heels and got to shine. The first guy to get cut off around the 5-minute mark was Chris Adams. They kept him isolated in the heel corner for a little bit and did the little constant in and out tags. There was a big miscommunication spot with Link trying a top rope dive where the rest of his partners got taken out, which allowed for the Iceman to get in there for the hot tag. And they went with the clever babyface outsmarts the heel finish, where Akbar tries to reach under the bottom rope to trip up the Iceman, but instead of one of the Super Ds falling directly down to pin the Iceman, he actually rolls through and then keeps him pinned for the 3 count. And, that obviously stirs things into motion with everyone getting into the 6-way brawl afterwards. Probably one of the more funny visuals during all of this was seeing the missing Link swing away in like 40 random directions and then bumble his way out of the ring at the end of all of it. Also enjoyed seeing one of the Super Ds try to smart mouth a young girl in the front row, and all she did was scoff at him. I just thought, these Dallas fans were way too kind. Or maybe they just found the right girl, figuring she wasn't going to try and fire back. That's some pretty ballsy stuff, though, man. I would not have trusted half those women in the crowd as far as I could throw them. Some of them probably had concealed weapons in their purses for all we know. I've read the horror stories of the kinds of things people would try to pull off or the weapons people would carry around with them at these live events. It was a crazy time back then, man. I would not trust anybody. But, all in all, fun little main event. I liked afterwards all the baby faces got to cut promos on all the heels they were currently in programs with. Kerry vowed to get his revenge on Kamala next week when he body slams him and gets the $20,000 because the General owes him another $10,000 for Kerry being able to slam Kamala on 2 straight occasions. Chris Adams still wants Jimmy Garvin in the American Heavyweight Championship. Sunshine wants that 5 minutes in the ring alone with Precious. And the Iceman wants 5 minutes with the General Skandar Akbar so he can show him what real pain is. And you can take that multiple ways if you have an immature brain capacity like I do. But for sake of debate, we will just say that he plans on whipping the General's ass. Whip him like a dog. But hey, a novel concept. Babyfaces feuding with heels and having motives and reasons for wanting to fight them. Motivations. Stories. Clear-cut good guys and bad guys. What's that thing you constantly hear, how you don't need babyfaces and heels in wrestling anymore? How those are things of the past, and we have to change with the times. Give me a fucking break. What a bunch of nimrods. Anyhow. Well, I think that'll take us to the end of this one. The Friday shows have been running a lot longer than usual, so I'm trying to be more cognizant of that as we start expanding on these shows. There is a little bit more to talk about. The Superstation shows tend to run a little longer now. We're kind of back to the 2-hour format instead of that sea of shows late last year where they were only running for about 30 to 45 minutes. So, gives us a lot more material to cover, but, well, it is what it is. More fun stuff to talk about. So, as we wrap up things for today, I don't think I have anything else to address here. There is the Royal Rumble this coming weekend, and I'm mentally trying to prepare myself for some of the horrors that are coming my way on Saturday night. So, I'll say this. I was going back and forth for the longest time of whether or not I wanted to do a card preview, and fuck it, let me just pull up the card real quick because I want to see what we have going on. Obviously, I know about a few of the matches, but right now I think it's only like maybe 4 or 5 that have been announced right now. Things could obviously change, but all right, so here we are on Wikipedia. So under the matches category, we have 5 things currently announced. There's the Men's Royal Rumble match, the Women's Rumble match, which, God almighty, I don't even want to get into that tangent now. But yeah, they're still doing that. We have the Mountain Dew Pitch Black match with Bray Wyatt and LA Knight, which everybody's sort of been waiting with bated breath for whatever reason. Still have not really been given any idea of what that match is going to be or what the stipulations are, but I imagine it's going to suck 10,000 cocks. Obviously, we have Roman Reigns and Kevin Owens. That's for the undisputed Universal title. And apparently another women's title match. Bianca Belair and Alexa Bliss. Oh my God. Oh my God. Really? Alexa fucking Bliss is getting a championship match? Oh. I hope it's short and sweet. That is all I can hope for. But hey, in completely unrelated news, apparently 16 of the 30 entrants have been announced. Dare I even run down the list? All right, who do we got? Well, obviously, we still have the split brand, so we got Raw and SmackDown here. Under the SmackDown banner, we have Kofi Kingston, Santos Escobar, Ricochet, Rey Mysterio, Gunther, Drew McIntyre, Sheamus, Braun Strowman, and Karrion Kross. And on the Raw side, we have Austin Theory, Seth frickin' Rollins, who apparently is still going by that name, Bobby Lashley, Baron Corbin, Cody Rhodes, which they've kind of spoiled now, Omos, Good Lord. And Dominic Mysterio. Okay, so here's why I'm laughing. Under the notes section, they have the little area of like how guys were announced as participants. So they have announced on SmackDown. For Ricochet, it's defeated Top Dollar in the qualifying match. For Theory, Rollins, and Lashley, that was announced on Raw. Same goes with Cody Rhodes and Omos. Drew McIntyre and Sheamus were apparently announced on Twitter. That's how those guys became participants. Here's Dominic's note. Announced on WWE's YouTube channel. Great. Just dandy. Oh yeah, I forgot about the women's match too. So the men have more than half the participants announced. There are seven women announced for the WWE Women's Rumble match as of January 27th. We have Liv Morgan, Candice LeRae, Rhea Ripley, Raquel Rodriguez Fernandez Gomez Sanchez III, Shayna Baszler, Zelina Vega, and Emma. Are you watering at the mouth, salivating to see what other 23 women end up being involved in this thing? Why do they even bother? Seriously, the match is tomorrow night. They have 7 women announced. 7 women. Most of them who really don't even look that appealing on paper. I didn't even realize Candice LeRae was still wrestling for the company. I mean, I know she's on Raw, so I haven't been paying attention, but when the fuck did she come back? What is the math on that? Like, is it like 20-something? 20-something% of the participants announced? Do they even have 30 women under contract? I mean, I imagine we'll get a few surprise entries in there. That's kind of the gimmick of the Rumble match every year because, again, I talked about it. That's sort of what the Rumble is now. It's not so much about the probable winners or the guys that could potentially get the world title shot, but it's just more about the surprises. It's kind of a shame that's where we are, but, when you overexpose this gimmick match so often, it kind of loses its appeal after a while. But, yeah, we'll see about that. I mean, this is a no-brainer. Out of the 7 women they have announced right now, Rhea Ripley's obviously the one that I would like to see win. I highly doubt she's going to because she hasn't been a thing in this company for years now. But who else is there? I mean, I'm trying to think. So Charlotte's the SmackDown Women's Champion. I think Bianca's the Raw Women's Champion. Okay. I don't really know why they have 2 women's champions to begin with, but well, I don't know why WWE does half the shit they do. It's 2023. I'm still contemplating all this years later. But, yeah. So there you go. You want my out-of-the-blue random predictions. I'll throw Rhea Ripley into the fire there, and Cody Rhodes is my prediction to win the Men's Royal Rumble match. And everything else, Roman over Kevin Owens, that's kind of a no-brainer. Bianca over Alexa Bliss, that's kind of easy to tell as well. I imagine Bray Wyatt's going over LA Knight. What tomfoolery and shenanigans they decide to throw into that debacle, I don't even want to know. I'm predicting that match to be -5 stars, but who knows? Who even fucking knows at this point? So this show looks like it's going to be somewhere in the ballpark of nah to really, really bad. Take your pick, I guess. But, okay. Now I know what I have to look forward to. So, catch you guys on Monday when we talk about that show and the next episode of the Retro Raw from 1994. No SmackDown report. Kind of already talked about that. You know, it'll be old news by the time the Royal Rumble show's over anyway. Let me know, chime in if you have any predictions or thoughts on the upcoming Rumble event over the weekend. But beyond that, we'll catch you guys on Monday. Take care. Thanks for watching. Peace out.